Hi, this is part one of how the so-called elites influence the world. In today's presentation, we're going to look at two really key things. We're going to look at Overton's window, which is how they manage the sort of discourse, how they can really dictate what you can and can't say. We'll also look at the pyramid of control, how they can exert huge amounts of control over systems by just understanding where to exert that control. So if this interests you, please continue to watch. Okay, good afternoon. Today's presentation is how the so-called elites influence the world. This is part one. We're going to have a series on these. There's many different ways that they do influence it. And I think it's very important for us to understand this because we can start putting a real spanner in the works and start to take back control over our own lives. So just quick introduction to the project. We have three main pillars of the project, which is how to have good, open and honest conversations. This isn't to convince anyone of anything. This is actually to create the conditions where people can actually start to see the information and make their own assessments. Secondly, how to message correctly, how to do flyers and social media messages very well and effective. The third one is behavior and how we're influenced. And today's is really going to start to look at the structures of this in much more detail. I think the first thing we're going to look at today is Overton's window, which is really, really key concept. And it's something that you'll notice with all the things that gradually come in where they're starting to normalize things. And this really is under this concept. And I'm just going to look firstly at what it is and then look at some examples. So really, what is Overton's window? It's the range of ideas the public will accept for public discourse. So it's things that are acceptable or considered normal. And once this window moves, anything in the window is accepted and anything outside rejected. So if we look at some historical examples of this, so this is Overton's window here. And initially, and anything outside of it's unacceptable. And of course, if you look at history, slavery was acceptable. And of course, nowadays, well, the official slavery is unacceptable. Obviously, some would argue that debt slavery and many other things are still at play. But then when you have women voting, that was previously unacceptable. And now that's moved inside, obviously, to be, acceptable that anyone, human, has the same rights. And then we look at things, and of course, both of those, I would agree that that's a progress and should be the case. We shouldn't have slavery and we should have everyone being able to vote. But when you look at something like income tax, previously that was unacceptable. And people don't realize that now that's become acceptable, really, in most countries. But when you look at history, the slavery was actually only abolished in the UK in 1833. Women only became to be able to vote in the UK in 1928. And in fact, income tax was only first introduced in the UK in 1799. And when it was only 2p in the pound. It was then abolished in 1816, but it returned in 1842. And then in the the general election of 1874, both parties, Disraeli and Gladstone, promised to repeal the income tax. As it turned out, Disraeli won the election, but didn't keep his promise. And you'll see that once income tax is accepted, then generations now don't even question it. Nobody really of a young age really questions income tax, but really, if we started to question it, we realize that it is very problematic. So let's look at the COVID. So really, the Overton's window is really what's considered normal and acceptable. And when you'll see public discourse, what they do is a lot of the things that we want to talk about, they keep outside of the window. And of course, if you saw any BBC public debate or whatever, they would keep both people inside the window. And it was very interesting when Andrew Mars was interviewing Chomsky, and Andrew Mars was claiming to be, a critical thinker who was after the truth. And Chomsky said to him, well, you can't be. And he said, why? He said, because they're allowing you to interview me. He said, if you really were that, there would be so much more that we could talk about. And Overton's window is very key. And if we look at the COVID Overton's window, what was acceptable, when you think about what was deemed radical and absurd initially, they had this clapping in this early treatment as being acceptable. I put the clapping in there partly for a joke because people thought, oh, it's just clapping, it doesn't make any difference. But lockdown prior to COVID would have been absurd. Gene therapy was not accepted in any way. It was considered very radical. Masking was completely absurd. I pretty much think when you looked initially, no one in the UK would do it. And when they looked at Asian cultures that did it, it was very concerning. And then you look at, triple masking was even more absurd, quarterly boosters for, etc. So what happened was that the window continued to move, and obviously segregation, if you spoke about it 3 years ago, most people would have said, oh no, it's terrible. And of course, what happened with so much of the propaganda is what they did was they got rid of early treatment. That was no longer acceptable. That was considered, unacceptable. And things like, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, all these things were considered, taboo. And of course, what happened was with the media, the window started to expand. So then things become normal. And of course, this is the power of the media, because if all the media outlets focus on the same thing, with the repetition, people then start to accept it. Of course, that's what's key with this Overton's window, is that where it moves is really, really key. And what we have to do is we have to not let it move to things, and we have to keep these things absurd when they are absurd. And of course, this really overlaps with the boiling frog. So the boiling frog story, which I'm sure most people will be familiar with, is really a metaphor of the inability of people to react to significant changes that occur gradually or to events which have become commonplace. So if it's done slowly, and the metaphor says that if you put a frog in boiling water and turn it up slowly, the frog will not realize until it's too late. Some have said it's a myth, but it doesn't matter really, because the metaphor is there to say that we're not reacting quick enough. And you could take anything that's moved over the last 20 or 30 years and look at something. And just as an example, let's choose, shopping in the supermarkets. When I think most of us, when we were kids, to actually self-serve yourself and bag things up was, a bit silly. And then card only, facial recognition, chip in hand, which is where they want to go to. As the window moves, if it moves slow enough, people really don't notice. They don't get that concerned. And I don't know if anyone saw that last week, the first person in the UK actually had the chip put in their hand. They paid to have it done. And now when they go around, they literally swipe their hand over the contactless things to pay. And obviously, anyone that's been aware of what's going on, that's just ludicrous. And anyone that suggested that was what they were planning was called a conspiracy theorist. And if you watch Richard Werner's videos, he, 1 year before the pandemic started, he talked about the Bank of England already had the chips ready. But of course, people won't accept them initially. And that's why you need this Overton's window to slowly move. So then we have the question is, where is Overton's window going? So if we look at how absurd things are, if any of these things we would have mentioned 3-4 years ago, they were absolutely ludicrous. But of course, the propaganda now is really trying to introduce them. Eating bugs, for instance. I know, we've probably all been to some Asian cultures where that's quite normalized, but for a Westerner to consider this is really very, very strange. Of course, they're pushing this no pet thing now, the own nothing and be happy, and of course, the transhumanism and chipped. So, of course, it's really key to understand these things and to really put a stake in the ground and to not let these things move, because that's what the propaganda and the predictive programming in the media is looking to do. And of course, you only got to look at something like this, is that to normalize mask wearing, and this person here is saying that she's deeply troubled by the normalization of it, because it really doesn't work anyway from all the studies. And it really is cultish, to be honest. When you look at these things, people aren't questioning, they're just taking them as facts. So hopefully that explains Overton's window. It's really worth looking to it a little bit. There's some really good videos on YouTube. But once you understand how this functions, and with a few other things that we're going to go through in later parts of this series, you're really going to understand how the so-called elites can really influence huge amounts of people with very little exertion. Because once you understand how a system functions, you can really exert a great amount of pressure onto that system. So the second thing we'll look at today is the pyramid of control. Now, this is really where you'll see in all corporations, it tends to be this way. The military tends to operate this way. And a lot of the regulation agencies tend to operate this way. And what do we mean by the pyramid of control? Well, if you took a company which had a lot of salesmen, at the base layer, you would have all the salesmen, and then you would have managers in the second layer, and then you'd have the boss. So this is just a 3-layer, but you can imagine bigger companies would have many layers. But effectively, whatever the decision the boss makes filters down to the salesman. So you will have in the pyramid of control, one or very few people exerting huge control over a large number of people. Now, where it gets very interesting is when you look at governing bodies. So if you look at the governing body would influence the boss, then what you would find is that governing bodies would put lots of control over many different companies. So when you looked at the policies within the pandemic, and you know that so many different companies now are controlled by the same group of people, once the governing body sets the policy, then you find that hundreds of companies were pushing vaccine mandates, etc. And where did that come from? Well, it comes from the people that fund in the governing body. So the elites look to influence the governing bodies. If they influence the governing bodies, then they set the policy, and then all the people under it really adhere to that policy. Excuse me. So what you can start to see when you think about this, when you think about any health and safety, for instance, whoever is setting the health and safety effectively exerts control over what people or companies can actually do. And this is why things like vaccine mandates are so nefarious, because you can find yourself in a situation where you're not freely able to move around. And of course, as an example, which from the Think Twice project, which we're involved with, look at how much the regulation agencies are influenced by the very people they are supposed to regulate. Now, anyone that knows anything about conflict of interest will know that this is ludicrous. People do not bite the hand that feeds them. And of course, there's much self-censoring going on now. And even I think it was the UK MHRA that actually stated they're not so much as regulators as facilitators. And that is truly ludicrous, because they're there to kind of set safety, not to help these things get sort of funded through. And of course, when you look at these numbers, the MHRA, etc., you'll see that a large amount of that money comes from, Billy Gates and his band of merry men. So it's really easy now to see how a few people can influence a huge system and a larger number of people, but just by understanding which parts of the system exert a lot of control. And this is where a lot of people are under the illusion that there's billions of different people and you'd have to influence millions and millions of different companies. You really wouldn't have to influence that many, particularly when it comes to the media. There's now only really 6 media companies that control, I think it's in the high 90% of all the media on the planet. And of course, media companies are effectively advertising companies now. Excuse me. So what happens is these shareholders, and they tend to be the same across these companies, the media won't report on things that basically conflict with their interests. So if you looked at Google, Google has a huge amount of investments in vaccines. So it's in their interest to really push against anything that's negative in terms of, the media messaging around those. And of course, this really, when you look at all the people that are underneath here, if you then are, you have a friendly relationship with these companies, say you donate money to them, as of course Billy has done in a lot of these, you start to get very favorable media. And there's a classic story, and I would highly recommend reading Cheryl Atkinson's book, Slanted. And she talks about the story of Boeing. Now, Boeing, obviously a huge company. Two whistleblowers approached Cheryl Atkinson, stating that their safety department was cutting corners and they weren't following protocol. So Cheryl Atkinson did a large expose, and it was due to go out, I think, on the Monday. And then what would normally happen is that there would be congressional hearings, there would be slapped wrists, Boeing would have to tidy up its processes, and then it would be sort of fixed to a certain degree. But what happened is just before the story was aired, Boeing lent on CBS, and then CBS pulled the story. So of course what you have is how they've influenced is, they just threaten to pull their advertising dollars, and bingo. And in the US, I mean, most of the companies are sponsored by Pfizer now, most of these news shows, and they don't even hide it, they promote it. Now, what happened in the Boeing instance is that the story didn't air, so then there was no investigation. And then over the next 2 years, 2 airplanes fell out of the sky related to those safety protocols. So it literally caused deaths. So when you have a point where interests and financial interests are put above safety and the public, that's when we're finding ourselves creeping towards this sort of dystopian, tyrannical sort of corporate autocracy, as they say. So hopefully that makes sense. So in summary of the 2 things we looked at today, Overton's window is how normal is moved and conditioned into the public by propaganda and predictive programming. So this new normal was really this marketing to say, okay, we're moving, they were overtly saying we're moving Overton's window. So what was previously accepted as normal is no longer normal. And, elbow bumping and wearing nappies on your face and everything else was considered the new normal. And of course, when you look at now, I mean, I was in Vienna last week and it's still compulsory to wear masks on the underground there. And a lot of people still do, to a point where me and my girlfriend actually got thrown off. Doesn't make any sense. And then we went across to Hungary and literally no one's wearing them. So really this normal is different for different places. And then on this second place, in terms of the period of control, if you know the governing forces in a system and can influence them, you exert huge force on a system. And that force can actually be far bigger than the system itself. So someone like Billy, who donates, 300 million to the media outlets, can actually create such a huge shift in perception. And of course, the media and the regulation agencies are condensed and funded by a few. And of course, regulation agencies, I think it's fair to say, can't really be trusted anymore because they're being funded by those they are supposed to regulate. And of course, if they say no, a lot of the people don't end up keeping their jobs. And Richard Werner, when I watched him in Austria, he actually mentioned how so many of the places now self-censor. So he told a story of Japanese economics in that, when the journalists go to the news conferences for the Bank of Japan, etc., for the central bank there, if they don't report as they're, kindly towards the economics and towards the Bank of Japan, they don't get invited back. So what they end up doing is they end up self-censoring. So they don't really say what they want to say. They say what's going to be welcomed by the people. And of course, you find this is the case. And I don't know if anyone, I've had this in my career a number of times, that when you speak up and you say things that are not popular, but truthful, sometimes you're just not invited back. So this is obviously very problematic. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And this will be recorded and uploaded, so you can obviously rewatch. Highly recommend looking into Overton's window to really understand that. And the pyramid of control, we will discuss more. Okay, so ways that you can support the project and help move us forward is either you can donate here, or I'm now available for one-on-one coaching. If you would like to do that, please email me. Or we have some workshops coming up. So we're actually doing a workshop on Monday, which is avoiding Christmas conflict. And we're going to show how to really clear the emotions down. So can I open it up for Q&A?